I always thought yard sales were harmless, a fun way to spend a weekend, picking through forgotten treasures and giving them a new home. I never believed the stories. Cursed objects, haunted antiques, whispers of strange happenings. But now, I know better. It started innocently enough. A sunny Saturday morning, a cheerful neighborhood lined with tables of old books, toys, and trinkets. I was drawn to them like a moth to a flame, blissfully unaware that some things are forgotten for a reason. 4 items, 4 seemingly harmless purchases, and each one carried a nightmare that clawed its way into my life. I can still hear the doll's laughter, see the reflection in the shattered mirror, feel the cold melody of the music box in my bones, and, God help me, I still see the family staring at me from that cursed photograph. This isn't just a story about yard sales. It's a warning I wish someone had given me before it was too late. It was a sunny morning when I stumbled upon an estate sale just outside of town. The house was old, its peeling paint and overgrown lawn giving it an eerie charm. Tables covered in trinkets and furniture lined the driveway, and I wandered through, hoping to find something unique. That's when I saw it. Nestled among dusty toys and broken knickknacks was a doll unlike any I'd seen before. It was about 2 feet tall, with porcelain skin that had faded to an unsettling off-white. Its eyes were glassy, too lifelike, and its mouth was painted in a faint smirk that seemed almost mocking. The most disturbing part, though, was its hair, long, matted strands of jet black that looked far too real. Creepy, isn't it? The woman running the sale said, startling me. She was older, with deep lines etched into her face and a voice that carried the weight of regret. Yeah, I admitted, unable to look away. It's been in my family for generations, she continued. No one wants it? Says it brings bad luck. I smirked, trying to mask my unease. How much? She hesitated, then said, $5, but don't keep it in your house for long. Things happen. I laughed nervously, brushing off her warning. $5 for a creepy antique? Why not? I brought the doll home and placed it on a shelf in my living room. It added a weird charm to the space, and I joked with friends about my haunted doll. But that night, things started to feel off. As I sat on the couch scrolling through my phone, I felt an odd sensation, like I was being watched. Glancing up, my eyes locked with the doll's glassy gaze. For a moment, I swore its smirk had deepened. Get a grip, I muttered, shaking my head. But when I turned off the lights to go to bed, I could still feel that gaze, heavy and unrelenting, as if it were boring into the back of my skull. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. It started small, doors creaking open on their own, objects shifting slightly from where I'd left them. I chalked it up to forgetfulness or drafts in the old house. Then came the noises. At night, I'd hear faint whispers, too quiet to make out, coming from the living room. I'd convince myself it was the wind or the hum of electronics, but deep down, I knew better. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard soft footsteps. My heart pounded as I strained to listen, the sound growing louder until it stopped just outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, expecting the door to creak open, but nothing happened. The turning point came a week later. I came home from work to find the doll sitting in a different position. I was certain I'd left it on the shelf, but now it was on the coffee table, its head tilted slightly to the side, as if studying me. I froze, the air growing colder around me. Okay, I whispered. Who's messing with me? No one was there. I put the doll back on the shelf, my hands trembling, and decided to ignore it. But that night, I woke up to the sound of something scraping across the floor. I turned on the light and nearly screamed. The doll was at the foot of my bed, its head tilted upward, staring directly at me. Terrified, I decided to get rid of the doll. The next morning, I drove to the nearest junkyard and tossed it into a dumpster. Relief washed over me as I watched the doll disappear beneath piles of trash. But when I returned home, it was sitting on the shelf, exactly where it had been before. I tried burning it, smashing it, even burying it in the woods. But no matter what I did, the doll always came back, pristine and untouched. The whispers grew louder, and now they were clearer. "Let us in," they said. "Let us in." That night, I woke to find the doll lying beside me in bed. Its glassy eyes stared into mine, and its porcelain hand was resting on my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The whispers surrounded me, louder than ever, and I felt a cold presence pressing down on me. When I finally broke free, I fled the house, leaving everything behind. I never went back. I left town, hoping to start fresh, but the doll still haunts me. Sometimes I wake up in my new apartment and find faint footprints leading to my bed. Other times I hear whispers in the dead of night, promising that it's only a matter of time. I know it's out there, waiting for me, and I know one day I won't be able to escape it. It was a cold, dreary Saturday when I wandered into a small antique shop tucked away in an alley I'd never noticed before. The musty smell of old wood and dust filled the air as I stepped inside, surrounded by shelves crammed with relics from another time. The owner, a frail old man with graying hair and a haggard face, barely looked up from behind the counter. His eyes were clouded, and he seemed to be lost in thought. As I explored the shop, something caught my eye. A large, ornate mirror leaning against the far wall. It had a heavy, gilded frame, intricately carved with symbols I couldn't quite recognize. The glass surface was slightly fogged, but still beautiful. "I'll take that one," I said, feeling an inexplicable pull toward it. The man's eyes flickered for a moment, then he slowly rose from his chair. His voice was barely a whisper. "It's not for sale." I froze, confused. "Why not? It looks perfect." "It's cursed," he said, his voice trembling. "A mirror like that brings darkness. You don't want it." I chuckled, brushing off his words. "It's just a mirror, old man." "How much?" He sighed heavily, but didn't stop me as I handed him the money. The moment the mirror was in my possession, I felt a strange weight settle in my chest, like something had just shifted, but I couldn't place it. I hung the mirror in the hallway of my apartment, the golden frame gleaming against the pale walls. It seemed to add a touch of elegance to the place, and I admired it every time I passed by. At first, everything seemed fine, but soon I began to notice subtle changes. I'd catch glimpses of movement in the reflection, shadows shifting in the corner of the glass, things that weren't there when I turned around. But when I looked closely, the mirror seemed perfectly normal. One night, after a long day of work, I stood in front of the mirror, brushing my hair. I hadn't noticed at first, but when I looked up, my reflection was off. It was as if the reflection was delayed. My movements were just a fraction of a second behind. And then, as I watched, my reflection smiled back at me. But it wasn't the smile I was making. It was wide and cruel, a twisted mockery of my own expression. I stepped back, my heart racing. But when I looked again, everything seemed normal. The more I stared into the mirror, the more unsettling it became. The reflection didn't just mimic my movements, it started to change. One night, as I passed by the mirror, I saw a figure standing behind me. The reflection was of a man, tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes. His face was pale, and his eyes were hollow. I spun around, but there was no one there. Shaken, I took a step closer to the mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure in the glass remained, its eyes locked on mine. I tried to move away, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. Suddenly, the reflection grinned, a slow, menacing grin that stretched impossibly wide. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the figure vanished. Over the next few weeks, the mirror grew worse. I'd wake up to find it covered in a thin layer of fog, no matter how warm the room was. Sometimes, I'd catch a glimpse of things moving behind me in the reflection, things that weren't in the room with me. One evening, I decided to clean the mirror, hoping to get rid of whatever had been causing the unsettling reflection. As I wiped away the fog, I noticed something strange in the glass. At first, I thought it was just smudging, but as I wiped it away, I saw a word written in the condensation. I dropped the cloth, my hands trembling. The word slowly began to fade, but I could still see it, etched in the glass, like it had been there for years. That's when the nightmares started. I began having vivid dreams. Nightmares, really. In every one, I was standing in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection. But the reflection was never quite right. The face in the glass would twist, contort, and shift into someone else, someone I didn't recognize. It was always someone with hollow eyes, like the man I'd seen in the reflection, staring at me with an intensity that felt like he was inside my head. And every time I tried to look away, I couldn't. I was frozen, trapped in the reflection, unable to move. One night, I woke up in a cold sweat, the echo of the nightmare still lingering in my mind. I stumbled out of bed, my breath quick and shallow, and walked toward the hallway mirror, as if drawn to it. I saw my reflection standing there, but there was something wrong. The reflection wasn't moving. I reached out to touch the glass, but before I could, I saw the figure from my dreams, standing just behind me in the reflection, its hollow eyes staring directly at me. I screamed and backed away, but the figure didn't move. Instead, it began to smile, slowly, cruelly. Terrified, I knew something had to be done. I couldn't keep living with that mirror. I tried to take it down, but the moment my hands touched the frame, the reflection changed. The figure in the glass began to reach toward me, its fingers pressing against the glass, as though trying to escape. I recoiled, but before I could pull my hands away, I felt something cold and icy grip my wrist. It was the figure. I fought to pull away, but it was like it was holding me captive, its cold fingers sinking deeper into my skin. With a final, desperate scream, I yanked myself away, breaking free from the mirror's grip. I ran to the door, but when I looked back, the reflection wasn't mine anymore. It was the figure. I left that apartment the next day, abandoning everything. The mirror remained there, undisturbed, its dark grip still lingering in my mind. Since then, I've never dared to look into another mirror. The thought of seeing that thing again, reaching out for me, is enough to send me into a panic. And I know I can never go back to that shop. I know that the mirror is still out there, waiting for someone else to take it home. I only hope they're strong enough to avoid the same fate I faced. It was a Sunday morning, gray and damp, when I decided to visit a local estate sale. The sign had caught my eye as I was driving down a narrow street in the outskirts of town. It looked old, probably a family home full of forgotten things. The house itself was a towering Victorian, with ivy crawling up the walls and an eerie stillness hanging around it. I stepped inside, greeted by the musty air of old wood and dust, and began wandering through the rooms. Most of the items were unremarkable. Broken chairs, tarnished silverware, books with yellowed pages. But then I saw it. A grand piano, sitting in the corner of the living room. The piano was gorgeous, a sleek black grand with ivory keys that looked untouched. There was something strange about it, though. Despite its age, it seemed to hold a presence, almost as if it were alive. An elderly woman approached me. She was frail and thin, with eyes that seemed too sharp for her age. "You've noticed it, haven't you?" she asked, her voice thin but steady. "The piano?" I nodded, unable to tear my gaze away from the instrument. "It's been in the family for generations, but no one plays it anymore. They say it whispers at night." She paused, her expression growing distant. "People who hear it? They're never the same." I smiled awkwardly, trying to laugh it off. "I'm sure it's just an old instrument. How much?" The woman's eyes narrowed. "It's not for sale," but I could see the way her fingers twitched, as if she wanted to rid herself of it. The piano was there, for sale or not, and I could feel something pulling me toward it. I walked away, but the piano stayed in my mind. A week later, I found myself back at the house, driving up the overgrown driveway. The piano still haunted my thoughts, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was meant to be mine. The elderly woman seemed almost relieved when I asked about it. "Take it. It's yours if you want it." And so, I had it delivered to my apartment. The moment it was placed in my living room, I felt something shift in the air. It was as if the whole room had become colder. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment, I heard it for the first time, a soft, eerie melody that seemed to float through the air. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but as I listened more closely, I realized it was coming from the piano. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the piano. The keys moved as if someone invisible were playing them, the notes haunting and dissonant, making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The melody stopped suddenly, and I felt an icy chill crawl down my spine. I rushed over and slammed the lid shut. After that night, things began to escalate. I would wake up to the sound of the piano playing, the same haunting melody, even though no one was near it. And when I tried to ignore it, to go about my day, the piano would still be in my thoughts. I began to dream about it too. In the dreams, the piano was always in the same place, its keys gleaming under dim, flickering lights. There was always a figure seated at it, their back to me, their fingers dancing over the keys. The person's face was always obscured by shadows, but I knew they were playing for me. The melody in the dreams was never the same, but it always felt wrong, like the music was trying to tell me something I wasn't supposed to understand. One evening I decided to record the sound of the piano to try and prove to myself that I wasn't imagining things. I set up my phone on a nearby shelf and waited. As soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the piano began to play again. It was soft at first, like a whisper in the dark, but then it grew louder, more insistent, each note more frantic than the last. I rushed over to the piano, but no one was there. I stared at the keys, each one rising and falling as if played by invisible hands. I could feel the cold air surrounding me, thick with the weight of the music. I turned off my phone and stepped away, heart racing. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I kept hearing the melody, echoing in my mind, even when I tried to block it out. The next morning, I woke up with an overwhelming sense of dread. I felt like something was watching me, waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that the piano was connected to something darker, something deeper than I could understand. I had to know more. I did some research on the house and its previous owners. The family had been wealthy once, living in the grand house for generations, but the stories surrounding them were chilling. The most disturbing part was the tale of the last person who had played the piano. The woman, Eleanor, her name was, had been a talented pianist, known for her beautiful performance, but one night she was found in front of the piano, her hands frozen in mid-air as if someone had stopped her from playing. The authorities couldn't explain it, and they ruled it a mysterious death. After her death, the piano was sealed away. It wasn't until years later that it resurfaced at the estate sale. The more I learned, the more I realized the piano wasn't just an object. It was a vessel, a conduit for something dark, something that fed on the souls of those who played it. I began to hear voices, soft whispers, barely audible, coming from the piano when I wasn't even near it. The music, too, always haunting, always calling. I tried to leave the apartment, but I couldn't escape the music. It followed me. It echoed in my mind when I walked down the street, when I went to work, when I tried to sleep. The figure in my dreams grew more distinct, its face now visible, though it was always in shadow. I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. And then the piano stopped playing. But something worse began. One night, as I stood in front of the piano, I knew it was time to confront whatever had been haunting me. I sat down, fingers trembling, and placed my hands on the keys. The moment I did, the coldness enveloped me, and I heard the faintest whisper, "Play." I hesitated, but then I began to play, the melody pouring from me as if I had no control. The music filled the room, louder and more intense, each note cutting through the air like a blade. Suddenly, I couldn't stop. My fingers moved of their own accord, playing faster, more erratically. The shadows in the room began to twist, to writhe, and the figure from my dreams emerged, standing behind me. I could feel its cold breath on my neck, its presence suffocating. The music reached a crescendo, deafening, unbearable, and then everything went silent. The next morning, the piano was gone. The apartment was eerily quiet, and I found myself sitting in the living room, unable to remember how I had gotten there. The figure, the music, everything vanished. But I know the truth now. The piano is still out there somewhere. I can still hear its faint, eerie melody in my mind. It will always be with me. And one day, it will find someone else. Someone who can hear its call. And then, it will begin again. I wasn't planning on attending another estate sale, But when I saw the sign that said, "Everything must go," I couldn't resist. I had a strange obsession with antiques, and something about this sale felt different. It was held at a large, decaying farmhouse on the edge of town, one I'd passed countless times but had never stopped to explore. The moment I stepped onto the property, a sense of unease crept up my spine. The house stood like a forgotten relic, windows dark and lifeless. There was an old barn to the side, its roof sagging, as if the house itself had given up on fighting the decay. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the wooden floor creaked beneath my every step. Rows of old furniture, tarnished silver, and faded paintings lined the walls, but something caught my eye. A large display case filled with porcelain dolls. I froze. There were at least 20 of them, all dressed in old-fashioned clothing, with glassy eyes that seemed to follow me. They were arranged in a perfect circle, each one positioned as if it were looking at the others. Their expressions were eerie, frozen in a perpetual state of calmness, but their eyes, those eyes, had something unsettling about them. I reached out to touch the glass case, and as my fingers brushed it, a chill ran down my spine. The elderly woman behind the counter watched me silently. "Would you like one?" she asked, her voice as dry as the dust in the air. I looked at her, unsure of what to say. "How much for them all?" The woman's lips twitched into a faint smile. "They're not for sale." "Exactly." My curiosity spiked. "What do you mean?" She sighed, her gaze growing distant. "They belong to the house. Whoever takes them, they take more than they bargained for." The warning was there, clear in her eyes. But I didn't listen. I couldn't. There was something about those dolls, something that pulled me in. I bought one of the dolls, a small, delicate girl with a lace dress and blonde curls. She seemed harmless enough, nothing more than a strange relic from the past. That night, I placed her on a shelf in my living room, beside my other trinket. But as the hours passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house felt colder than usual, and every time I glanced at the doll, I could swear her eyes were just a little more focused. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my imagination, but that night I heard something, a faint whisper. It came from the direction of the shelf where the doll sat. I dismissed it, convincing myself it was the wind or the house settling. But then I heard it again, this time clearer. "Help me!" I turned toward the sound. The doll was still sitting on the shelf, but there was something different about it now. Its head was tilted slightly, and its eyes seemed to gleam in the dim light. I shook my head and walked over to it, but as I reached out, the whispering stopped. The room fell into a heavy silence. The next day, the whispers began again. This time, it wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus, dozens of faint voices murmuring in the background, like a group of children talking just out of earshot. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it felt like the dolls were watching me. That night, I decided to take the doll back to the estate sale, thinking I had made a mistake. But when I arrived, the woman was gone. The house was abandoned, and the barn was locked tight. The sale had ended, but the eerie feeling still lingered. I went home, unsettled, but when I opened the door to my apartment, I was met with the sound of soft, tinkling laughter. The doll was still there, sitting on the shelf, but now there were others. 2 new dolls, placed carefully beside the first one. I hadn't bought them. No one else had been in my apartment. And yet, there they were. Over the next few days, the dolls multiplied. Each time I came home, there was another doll on the shelf, each one positioned to face the others. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and I could make out words now. Take us home." I couldn't sleep. The laughter would echo through my apartment, and when I tried to leave, I felt the pull of the dolls, like invisible strings tugging me back to them. It was as if they were trying to tell me something I didn't understand. I began researching the dolls. To my horror, I found that the dolls had once been part of a collection owned by a wealthy family, a family that had mysteriously disappeared years ago. The house, the one I had visited, had been abandoned for decades, and there were no records of the family ever having been found. But there were rumors. People whispered about a curse, about children who had once owned the dolls, who had vanished one by one. The dolls, it seemed, were not just toys. They were vessels for something dark, something that fed on the souls of those who came into contact with them. One night I couldn't take it anymore. The dolls were everywhere, sitting on chairs, perched on windowsills, even crowding around my bed. The whispers had become deafening. "Help us!" I ran out of the apartment, desperate to escape the madness. But no matter where I went, the dolls followed. They appeared in every reflection, in every shadow. The whispers echoed in my ears, growing louder and more desperate. I returned to the house. The dolls were waiting for me. As soon as I stepped through the door slammed shut behind me. The woman's voice echoed from the shadows. "You took them. Now, you belong to them." The dolls began to move. They crawled, their glassy eyes glowing in the dark, their porcelain faces twisted into cruel smiles. I tried to run, but the house had changed. The walls closed in, the floors shifted, and the dolls? They followed, they whispered, they laughed, they reached for me. The next morning, the house was empty. The dolls were gone. But as I sat in my apartment, trying to forget the horrors I had seen, I noticed something strange. The doll I had taken home, the first one, was still there, sitting on the shelf. And it was smiling. I realized then that the curse was never about the dolls. It was about the people who took them. The dolls didn't move on their own. They were waiting for someone to bring them to life. And once they were awakened, they could never be stopped. I knew what I had to do. I packed my things, left the apartment, and never looked back. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I hear the faintest whisper, calling my name. And I know the dolls are out there, waiting for someone new to take them home. And when they do, they'll never leave.